Hey, this is Robert Monroe, and I'm coming at you with an interesting new reaction series. And what we're going to do is we're going to react to royalty-free music. And we're doing this for two reasons. Reason number one, I don't like getting copyright struck. And almost every time I react to something, somebody pulls the video, it doesn't see anything, and I've just wasted a couple hours of my life getting it ready for YouTube. The second reason is a buddy of mine is getting into this industry, and I thought it would be very cool to sample what is there and explain what it is that makes it sound the way it does. And therefore, you know what it's good for, but also when you maybe should look out to hire a musician to really try to elevate what you're trying to do. Because there's only so far you can go with this free, royalty-free music. But if you're not a musician, you might not know where that ceiling is. So without further ado, let's get into it. I want to give credit to anyone that I put. I will put them in the comments below what their channel is, all that stuff. But let's get into it. So this first 12 hours of free background music, copyright-free music for creators and streamers by The Relaxed Movement. All right, let's get into it. A couple things I'm noticing right away. We've got some pitter-patter rain in the background. That's kind of, I guess, unique and useful because it can really locate your video. So if you are having it on a rainy day, or if it's moody and it's kind of withdrawn, maybe a little sad, maybe a little down, that could go with it. I can see some negatives right away. If you're having a sunny scene, the rain effect doesn't make sense. If you're trying to put in your own effects to kind of give you an idea of where you're at and what's going on, your own atmosphere, this immediately kind of forces your hand. So that's an interesting choice. They could have picked some other ambience that would have elevated the song without having that rain effect. Anyway, I'm getting too caught up on the rain effect. What else is going on? We've got a synth going on at the beginning. Nice way to begin, nice simple thing. Will help if you want to drop some intensity going into your video, you know, some development. Let's talk about that chord progression. Okay, we are in E minor, but in reality, I would actually probably call this G major. And if you want to know why I would call it G major, we'll have to do that in something else because that's Nashville number system. I don't want to get into that. This video is really primarily for non-musicians. So we have a simple chord progression, 6, 5, 4, 5. If you don't know what that means, effectively this is the boilerplate I am doing electronic music or background music chord progression. Now, why am I saying that? It's because this chord progression is used all the time for its chillness, for its ability to just continue over and over and over again, and always give you just this, you know, we're just hanging. Everything's loose, everything's cool vibe. So we got this whole thing going. And then this piano melody introduces itself. What? Something like that. And another thing to note, it repeats itself twice, changing drastically the second time. But the rhythm, the speed of the notes, stays exactly the same for both. Two important things to note. Let's listen to another about 30 seconds of this, and then maybe we'll cut to a different part in this 12-hour video, talk about some other stuff. Nice little effect there. They cut out the rain effect just to give it a little bit of air, a little space for that drum drop in. Pretty effective little editing there. That's nice to see, that little attention to detail. Let's keep going. We have this drum track that is definitely just a one and done, one measure. But we did get to help it give it a little more shape. Near the end of the loop. We'll talk about phrases in a second. There's a couple things that I want to mention. Repetition is one, variability or change is another, and phrases is another. So all three of these things we're going to come back to every video, because this is, to me, what really makes the royalty-free music sound so blah, for lack of a better term. We got the bass in now. Very similar drop to before, just that pullback and then everything in. A little too empty in my opinion. Nothing is leading us to the next section. The song could be over there. Maybe that's what they want actually, is if you just wanted a minute, you could just cut it there. Maybe that's why they did it so clean. It feels, I don't know, doesn't feel like we're going anywhere. Yet another issue with just kind of this copy paste music style is that could work if I'm cutting it at a minute, but I could just fade out or cut it myself anyway. But because there's no lead in, now the choice to continue is strange. So music has choices involved that make decisions that decide what it's going to be good for. So if I make a decision one way, it doesn't give me the flexibility to make it good for another thing. So using it multi-purpose for everything is a problem. So again, yet another theme we're going to get into. But let's listen a tiny bit more, and then I want to talk about my points on this. One detail I didn't point out yet, at this point we've added in the synth. So synth is just a digital instrument. Well, I guess it technically can be also analog, but effectively it's an electronic instrument that is a keyboard sound where you're taking basically just raw waves and you're turning it into something, versus like an acoustic instrument or even an electric instrument like guitar, where there's a physical thing that you're pushing that's creating a very complicated wave pattern. And so that's why guitars have that unique sound, pianos have that unique sound, whereas a synthesizer has a very simple electronic sound. So that gets added back in. We have that contrast now between the drums, the piano, and that synth. We brought it back in. It's a very cheap way to develop music. We basically had these things separate, now we're putting them together. And now we just keep adding, we just keep layering. And if I had to guess, that's what we're gonna do for the rest of this particular song, is we're just gonna keep layering, maybe occasionally pulling a layer out, but that's all we're doing. All right, let's get into the meat of why I think this could be done better by someone with more time, specific to your project. So before I get into that, I do want to say I am not trying to offend anyone. I'm not trying to bash the relaxed movement or any of these sort of content for free models. And let me clarify a little bit. I am going to be critical. It may even sound harsh, but what I'm doing is I'm criticizing the very nature of this type of thing. This is non-specific. This is also made very cheaply on purpose, because if you spent more time on it, you would want to charge, because otherwise, how are you going to sustain yourself? How are you going to bring attention to yourself? That is really what's going on with these. They're made extremely quickly. You could make a track like this in an hour or less if you really knew what you were doing. We might even try that in a different video. But let's get into why this sounds the way it does and how you could elevate this very simply. So let's start out by first talking about this phrase length problem. Now, just to get an idea of what phrase length is, we have these things called measures, which are every 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You get the idea. That's what makes music feel dancey, feels groovy. We want that repetition. That repetition is great. Now, we also have something called the phrase length. The phrase length is when we group those into a distinguishable loop. And in this case, it's 4 measures. Ba-dee, da-da, ba-da, da. Take my word for it, that's for 4 groups of these, so 16 beats total. If you notice, that phrase length is rock solid, set in stone, from the beginning. Almost nothing violates that. Now, is there anything exactly wrong with that? No. Mozart started doing that way back in the day. We call that the classical period of music because that was when this idea came into play and really started a lot of the trends that we have in modern music. A lot of people trace modern music all the way back to the Baroque era, but if you listen to Bach, you know that doesn't sound like what we do now. Mozart, though, does, and a lot of this has to do with this regularity, this every 4 measures doing something, and then doing it again, and then varying it a little bit, but always in this 4 measure chunk where we have a start, middle, end. The difference, though, between Mozart and this is Mozart will sometimes break this pattern, and also Mozart will write over the bar line or going into the next one. So a very simple thing would have been to take that melody, pause somewhere earlier, and then have the melody go into the next 4 measure phrase. So something like da-dee-dee. Change the rhythm a little bit. Ba-da-da-da. Da-da-da. Then here we go. Something like that. Yeah, but something really distinct as well. Immediately draw your attention, immediately elevate it. That's my little beef on phrase length. Let's talk about repetition for a second. In general, repetition, especially for this style, especially for something in the background, is super good. You want repetition. Repetition is your friend. It's going to help you write this faster because you can just copy paste, although we'll get into that in a second. Copy paste is, it's good and bad at the same time. The second part of this, though, is it's comforting and it also helps it pull it into the background. The more things change, the more it's going to draw our attention, although that's also not really true. Again, these concepts are complicated. I'm trying to simplify them, but if there's anything that you're just confused by, you're like, what in the world is he talking about? Just drop a comment. I can address it in a video or just reply to your comment. So, repetition. that is what teaches us how to listen to the song we're listening to. So this song set up some things right away. And again, I like a lot of the things it set up. A chord progression that repeats, fantastic. A general framework for the rhythm, fantastic. Instruments that come back and are not just randomly thrown in. You know, you don't have guitar 1 second and then flute another and then oboe the next. No, we mostly have the same instruments. The flute coming in way later is a little problematic in my opinion. They should have probably set that up earlier if they wanted flute. Again, we won't get into every single one of my gripes. That's all good. Let's talk about the repetition that's bad. Or bad may be too extreme. Let's talk about the repetition that's not as optimal. One is the melodic rhythmic repetition. Da, dee, 2, 3. Ba, ba, 2, 3. Ba, ba. That's the whole thing. There's like one part that's slightly different than that. Because the notes change, but the rhythm doesn't, our brain just kind of goes, whoop, not paying attention anymore. And you might go, but it's background music, that's okay. Yes, but do you really want your video to just be vanilla and kind of boring from the beginning? You can have it still be background music, still fade into the background, but have a little more interest. So you could start out with that rhythm. Da, da, dee, 2, 3. Da, da, 2, 3. Da, da. I would do something different the second pass. Da, 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 da. Maybe a longer pause. Another thing that in general people are afraid of in this style is taking your time. And that gets us into the second thing that's kind of a no-no for me in terms of repetition. And that is you should never, and be careful with nevers, because typically when there's a never, it's not actually true because rules are meant to be broken. But you should never do something every 4 measures. What they're doing is every 4 measures, they're adding in an instrument or taking out an instrument. It's so predictable and so boring. All you would have to do is add something in 2 measures. Take 8 measures, do the same thing for 8 measures. That never happens in this. Every 4 measures, boom, something new. Every 4 measures, boom, something new. It gets a little tiresome. Our ears start to go, really? This is what's happening? We need that change, that adjustment. Go listen to anything by Michael Jackson and you'll hear immediately what I'm talking about. It's 2 measures in, we have something new. Then 8 measures long, we're holding on something. 12 measures, back and forth, varying the phrase length, but also varying our expectations. So we never know. Michael Jackson, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna do a half chorus where we cut it in half? Again, love it. That's why Michael Jackson got so popular, was because of doing stuff like that. Really, that's why people a lot of times credit Quincy Jones with being so much of the oomph behind Michael Jackson's music, because he helped with a lot of that. Anyway, that's a subject for a different day. That leads me into the last gripe I have with repetition, and that is the drums. This drum groove is so tiresome. Why is that? Well, most of the time, there are exceptions, don't get me wrong, but most of the time, even a loop, so a pre-recorded, pre-programmed drum loop, is going to have a little signs of life to keep interest going. It's going to be you see that? Doesn't take much. Very, very, very minimal change, and immediately it's like, ooh. So if we had varied that drum groove, so it wasn't a 1 measure phrase, it was like a 2 measure phrase. So You heard me talk about the 4-measure phrases. The drums are a 1-measure phrase. It's just one thing that goes over and over and over again, every 4 beats. Very tiresome to our ears. So that's the repetition side. Now let me talk about one thing more briefly because it's really not used very much, and that is variability or change, I guess would be a better term for it. In terms of change, we have the melody. The melody changes. And then the instruments change. Again, kind of like repetition, change is very good. I'm going to actually say something that might be controversial, depends on your style. Change is not as good as repetition. And you might be going, but wait, don't I want my song to be interesting? Here's the thing. If I go, look over here, now look over here, now look over here, now look over here, I've lost your attention. Because now you're just going, well, you just want my attention on all these little things. I have nothing to pay attention to. I'm going all over the place. So change has to be used sparingly. One of my favorite quotes about music, and I can't remember who it was, so I apologize, is minimalism is about change. You hear that? So minimalism is about change. Whereas music that changes all the time is about repetition. So when you're listening to the most intense prog metal and they're changing, time signatures all the time, our ears are getting tired of all that change and we're hoping that they repeat something. So we have something to latch onto, to hold on to for dear life. Whereas if I just play the same thing over and over and over again, think about dubstep. You're listening to the same thing over and over and over again. And you're like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Then the drop happens and you're like, oh, that was amazing. So they are in this relationship where one reinforces the other. But I would say in that relationship, repetition really should be the more important piece, and change can be this nice refresh that happens. So the change, how do they use change in this? They have the melody, and the melody is all over the place. The rhythm stays the same, but in that 8 measures or so that we have melody, it's back and forth. Let's listen to it one more time. Da, da. So there's literally only one thing repeated in that melody, which is the B to E. Everything else that they do is all over the place. We're going every which way. It almost feels AI generated. This type of music will 100% be done by AI sooner than you think. Potentially some of these 12-hour playlists are already done by AI because all of the type of things we're hearing here can be programmed quite easily. The type of stuff I'm talking about, you could probably still do with AI, but it's going to take a much more sophisticated model to train an AI than this. This is very simplistic for the most part. So, why is that bad? Well, our ears don't really ever have anything to latch on to. That's what really makes this change distracting. The second one is these instruments. We did synth, 8 measures go by, now piano comes in, 8 measures go by, now there's drums, 8 measures go by, now, well, 4 measures go by in that case, now there's bass, 4 measures go by, now there's flute, back and forth and back and forth. It's just like, it's too much. We could have actually had just that synth for 8 measures, 16 measures, and that would have been fine for me. Now you might go, okay, but that doesn't work if I'm doing a 30-second hype video and I just want some chill in the background. I get it. That's where you might want something even more intense. You might want it every 2 measures. Well, guess what? You're just talking about hiring somebody to make something specific for your project, or finding a much more tailored, created creation that you can get somebody to do. I was thinking about looking at more than one example per these clips, but I'm getting close to the 30-minute mark and we've only been talking about one. So I think we're gonna leave this episode where it's at, and I will just film more talking about other ones. But until next time, here's my big takeaways. Lots of really nice things in this. Whoever's doing this relax movement, you know how to write music. The music is generally fine. But I would encourage content creators, people making media, to think about partnering with somebody who can really elevate your content. Any of us doing this know to stand out, you want that extra level of quality. This might be where it comes from in your videos, is doing something a little more tailored. All right, I'll get off my high horse. I'm Robert Monroe. Like and subscribe. We'll get into more of this stuff. Hope you're learning along the way, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.